The Mortuary Assistant was released in early August and, in a matter of weeks, managed to prove that the foundation for modern horror games has become ineffective. It has a distinct lack of certain features that many consider to be intrinsic to the genre, which, instead of making it worse, actually contributes to the disturbing experience it provides. Because of this, the game adds a new twist to single-player horror and points to certain aspects of horror media that urgently need to be changed. This article contains spoilers for the Mortuary Assistant. The Mortuary Assistant has a similar premise to Five Nights at Freddy's, Phasmophobia, and others like them. While starting her career at the Riverfields Mortuary, Rebecca Owens, the protagonist, is warned that she has been made the target of a demon who is going to possess her. To stop this process and keep her identity, she must discover the demon's name, find the body it's associated with, and banish it. With the local mortician, Raymond Delver, instructing her through a series of tapes, she spends her first shift embalming bodies and being mercilessly tormented by a demon she's trying to get rid of. While many indie developers with premises similar to this would benefit from adapting their game to a style similar to Five Nights at Freddy's, the Mortuary Assistant flourished exactly for not doing so. Much like how Poppy Playtime improved FNAF monster designs and highlighted the game's issues, this newly released horror title challenged the previous formula for making games in this genre. By successfully creating an experience in which the horror is dependent on an eerie atmosphere, randomized events and the player's own imagination, it proved that common factors like loud jump scares and roaming enemies are becoming overused and dull. The Mortuary Assistant is very eerie and tense. One of the most common tropes in horror games is surprising the player with loud and unexpected jump scares. Titles like Outlast and Resident Evil even have spikes of change in the soundtrack, complementing and heightening this effect. Although this is effective to keep fans acutely aware and suspicious of the surrounding environment, on its own, it doesn't create a horrifying experience. In fact, they can become either predictable or boring, which can heavily impair players' experience in gameplay sessions. Unlike the popular horror franchise Five Nights at Freddy's and others in the same genre, in the Mortuary Assistant, the jump scares aren't supposed to be the main sources of horror. Instead, the game relies on building a uniquely tense atmosphere. The game often drowns players in an oppressive silence as they try to do their tasks, making each noise capture their focus. The demonic activity itself also typically contributes to this, with knocks on doors, running footsteps, eerie phone calls and shadowy figures staring at the player from a corner, making them even more nervous. Then, as they become even more suspicious of their surroundings, Mortuary Assistant introduces a highly complex demonic activity type that frequently ends in a jump scare, breaking this tension. Throughout the story, this will happen many times, and it gives a new meaning to this common trope, challenging the necessity of what was considered one of the cornerstones of making horror games. Randomized events make the Mortuary Assistant unique. Resident Evil 3 Remake changed various aspects of the original, which caused many to be disappointed by it. One of the biggest complaints directed at it was the fact that most of the encounters with the game's main villain, Nemesis, occurred in a scripted way. This meant that players always knew which were the triggers for a certain apparition or cutscene, which made the experience boring for many. However, this is a problem that affects most horror games and severely impacts their replayability. In an uncommon, but not unheard of move, the Mortuary Assistant has randomized the events that signal demonic presence and activity. While doing this is highly risky because it requires a large and varied selection of scares, the game managed to succeed in doing it. This is mostly due to other aspects of the gameplay being extremely repetitive, such as the tasks to banish the demon and the embalming process itself. To try to solve this issue, games like Phasmophobia added new ghosts, locations and items, while the Mortuary assistant opted to randomize many of the demon's preferred ways of tormenting Rebecca. Randomized scares mean that, in some way, each gameplay session can be completely different from the last, even if players are doing the same tasks. Not only that, but the game has 5 endings that usually require repeated playthroughs, as if Rebecca had continued going to work after surviving her first demonic possession attempt. And having random events occur through the shifts, combined with new backstory being discovered for the protagonist, makes the Mortuary assistant even more unique and balanced. The Mortuary assistant explores players' deepest fears. Many modern horror games also try to create fear within players by creating a monstrous entity that poses a threat to their lives and is constantly roaming. Resident Evil 2's Mr. X is a great example of this trope. He stomps around the police station, stalking the protagonists, and creates a big part of the game's horror due to the uncertainty of where he is and when he is going to find them. The Mortuary assistant doesn't have a roaming villain, but it still manages to recreate this overwhelming feeling of uncertainty. The game often puts scares into its most mundane tasks, such as answering the phone and going into another room to retrieve something. And with a carefully crafted balance between the demonic activity and the tension, it subjects the players to fearing the creations of their own imagination as they carefully try to predict and avoid many of the scares. Unlike Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Remake's villains, the demon in the Mortuary assistant doesn't roam and barely shows up in person. Instead, the game's scariest moments come from the anticipation combined with the tension. Nothing might be happening on screen, but players are fearing what could and what might pop out from the shadows. Combined with the randomized factor of the scares, it's unlikely that most of them even know how many types of demonic activity there are, which contributes even more to the fright. The Mortuary assistant has plenty of features that make it different from other horror titles, while managing to remain interesting and terrifying. It challenges certain concepts that were considered essential when developing games of this genre, such as the necessity of loud jump scares and roaming enemies, while presenting new ways to build intrigue and fear without them. Despite being an indie game with only a single developer, Brian Clark, the Mortuary assistant defies the pillars of modern horror, and fans can only wait for Clark's next project.